My name is Isabel Grant, and I was born in a quiet suburb just outside of Portland, Oregon. From the outside, we looked like the picture-perfect middle-class American family. Our house sat behind a white picket fence with a yard full of lavender, and we had those cozy family dinners that looked like they belonged in a Hallmark movie. But behind the soft lighting and the family portraits on the wall, the truth was far more complicated. I was the firstborn daughter of Thomas and Elaine Grant, both staunch believers in modern parenting philosophies. My father, a software engineer, obsessed with numbers and logic, often said he wanted a child who would become something remarkable. My mother, meanwhile, once boasted to her friends that she read over 40 books on child psychology before I was born. Their expectations were sky high, and from the moment I took my first breath, I was a project, a blueprint they intended to perfect. I remember being just 3 years old, struggling to count to 20, while my mother frowned from across the kitchen. "Thomas," she muttered, her voice tinged with both worry and disappointment. "I don't think she's progressing fast enough. We may be missing the golden window." My father didn't argue. He just looked at me like I was a math problem that gave the wrong answer, no longer worth solving. Things only got worse when my younger sister Chloe was born a year later. Almost overnight, my mother transformed the entire house. Every room was filled with developmental toys, color-coded emotion cards, and imported educational tools. Chloe had a high chair that played Mozart, plush books from Denmark, and a personal language tutor before her second birthday. Meanwhile, I was handed pre-printed workbooks, a dull pencil, and daily reminders that I needed to try harder. I remember once, at age 8, bringing home a second-place ribbon from a school-wide art contest. I was practically bursting with pride. My mom took one glance at my painting and said flatly, "That's nice. Chloe read an entire short story in English today." Dad didn't say a word. He was busy assembling a new logic puzzle board for Chloe in the basement. Over time, I stopped expecting praise, or attention, or even a glance. I faded into the background of my own home like furniture no one dusted anymore. I was there, but not really seen. By the time I turned 11, I had perfected the art of invisibility. My greatest victories were met with shrugs, my worst days with silence. But still, I tried. Not because I thought they'd change, but because I was holding on to some small, desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, if I tried hard enough, they'd finally see me. I didn't know then that the first step to healing wouldn't come from them. It would come from me. But before that could happen, life at home had to hit a breaking point, and it was closer than I realized. That breaking point came sooner than I expected. It was the fall of the year I turned 12, and everything felt fragile, like my presence in the house was more of a formality than a belonging. The one place I found comfort was my bedroom, the upstairs room that overlooked the woods behind our house. I'd wake up to gentle sunbeams filtering through the blinds, a quiet moment of peace before another day of trying to matter. One evening, I had just finished hanging a new sketch on my wall, an imagined cityscape I'd poured hours into, when Chloe burst in without knocking. She stood in the doorway like she already owned the space. "Mom says I'm moving in here," she announced, her voice casual. "This room's bigger and I need more space for my study area." I blinked at her, stunned. "No," I said simply. "This is my room." She shrugged like it wasn't up for debate. "Whatever," she said, walking off. I thought it was a misunderstanding. A joke, maybe. But the next afternoon when I got home from school, my world shifted in one harsh blow. My belongings were gone, moved to the smaller room near the laundry. My sketchbooks, my books, even the pillow I always slept with, relocated without warning. And there it was. My old room now had Chloe's name on the door in shiny gold letters, her new white desk glowing under the light, her supplies neatly, stacked like a display in a catalog. I walked into the smaller room, where my things were crammed against the walls. The bed touched two sides. The desk could barely fit a lamp, and the air felt colder, like even the space itself knew I didn't belong. I stood there, fists clenched, tears stinging my eyes. And then I called out, "Mom!" She was in the hallway, folding towels. "Why would you do this?" I asked, my voice shaking. "That was my room. I've had it since I was little." She didn't even look at me. "You're older now," she said, calm as if she were reading off a script. "It's time you learn to make space for others. Chloe needs it more than you do. Don't make a scene, Isabel." That was the moment I knew. It wasn't just favoritism. It was erasure. My existence, my needs, my feelings. They weren't even considered. I walked back into the new room, shut the door, and sat on the edge of the too-small bed. The light from the hallway seeped in under the door, pale and unfamiliar. That night, something in me shifted. I wasn't the priority. I never had been. But in that silence, something else quietly took root. A resolve I hadn't named yet. One that would grow stronger with every passing day. Senior year of high school came faster than I expected, but nothing else changed in the Grant household. The air still revolved around Chloe, whose academic journey had now evolved into a full-blown production. She attended a prestigious private school across town, driven there each morning in a brand new SUV, with a private tutor visiting twice a week. Her schedule was color-coded and managed like a corporate executive's. And me? I still walked to my public high school every day, handled every assignment, club, and responsibility on my own. I packed my own lunch, balanced a part-time job on weekends, and studied late into the night under the dim glow of my undersized desk lamp. I never complained, not because I had nothing to say, but because I knew by now no one would really listen. But I still held on to one hope: college. I thought that would be the great equalizer, the place where my efforts would finally speak for themselves. Then came the night that shattered even that illusion. My grandparents, Eleanor and Walter, came over for dinner. Two of the only people in the family who ever made me feel seen. We were eating one of my mother's famous lasagnas, and Chloe, of course, was going on and on about a potential summer program at Stanford. Everyone at the table nodded and smiled like she was announcing a Nobel Prize nomination. Then Grandma Eleanor turned to me with her warm smile. "And what about you, Isabel? Have you made any college plans yet?" For the first time all evening, I felt the air shift. Someone had actually asked me a question. I sat up straighter. "I applied to the University of Oregon and UC Davis. I just got accepted into Oregon's business program on a partial scholarship. If I can secure more aid, then..." I didn't even get to finish. My mother set her fork down with a clink that rang louder than it should have. "Isabel," she said, her voice tight but rehearsed, "your father and I have discussed this. We won't be able to provide more financial support for your tuition this year." I blinked. "What?" Dad jumped in quickly, like he had a script. "We need to prioritize Chloe right now. She's been accepted into an Ivy League prep program. It's a rare opportunity." I stared at them, stunned. "So, all the college savings you said were for both of us?" Mom sighed, like she was tired of explaining the obvious. "Chloe has real potential. You might want to consider starting at a community college, or taking a gap year to work. That's not a bad option either. Not a bad option." It echoed in my chest like a punch. They were cutting me off. Completely. The room went silent. The only sound was Grandma Eleanor's spoon slowly stirring against her plate. She finally looked up, her eyes sharp. "Elaine," she said, voice low. "Both girls are our granddaughters. I can't sit here and watch you cast one aside." My mom tensed. "Mom, this isn't..." "Yes, it is. Grandpa Walter said, cutting her off. His voice was calm, but firm. It absolutely is. That night, as I was clearing the dishes in the kitchen, Grandma Eleanor came over quietly. She placed a hand on my shoulder, the kind of gentle touch I hadn't felt in years. "You don't have to carry this burden anymore, Isabel," she said softly. "We'll pay for your college tuition. All of it. No loans, no strings attached." I froze, my hands still wet from rinsing plates. "But that's too much," I whispered, blinking back tears. It's not your responsibility." "It's not too much," she replied, her smile full of something deeper than generosity, belief. "Not when it's an investment in someone who tries, who never stopped trying, even when it felt like no one was watching." I didn't know how to thank her. I didn't even know if I could. My chest ached with emotion, but for the first time in a long time, it wasn't pain. It was relief. "You don't need favoritism to shine, Isabel," she added. "You already have." A few months later, I moved into my dorm at the University of Oregon. My parents didn't help me pack. My mom gave me a stiff, obligatory hug at the door and muttered, "Be frugal, and don't expect anything from us." Chloe didn't even look up from her phone, but I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I walked down the front path of that house with my suitcase in one hand and my dignity in the other. That walk felt like crossing a line, from being invisible in my own home to finally claiming space in my own life. College was nothing like home, and that was exactly what I needed. I wasn't the other daughter anymore. I wasn't the second thought, the backup plan, the faded photograph on the fridge. I was Isabel Grant, business major, focused, determined, unstoppable. Professors began to notice my work, my ability to dissect strategies, to analyze patterns not just in numbers but in behavior. Friends came to me for advice on projects, resumes, and future plans. I spent countless nights at the library, balancing part-time shifts at a cafe downtown with hours of studying and researching investment models online. Every Saturday night, I called my grandparents. I'd tell them about the smallest wins, the paper I aced, the customer who complimented my coffee art, the marketing professor who told me I had a sharp mind for strategy. They listened, always, like every word mattered. And as for my parents, they never called, not once, no check-ins, no holiday messages, no birthday cards. And strangely, I wasn't even upset. I didn't need their validation anymore, because I had finally stopped chasing it. What I had now was real. Not applause for the sake of appearance, not love with conditions. It was worth that came from within, and that was everything. By the time I entered my senior year, something inside me had changed completely. I no longer saw myself as the forgotten daughter. I saw a woman with purpose, with grit, with a fire that had survived despite years of being smothered, and I knew this was only the beginning. It was the spring semester of senior year when my professor, Dr. Elgin, pulled me aside after class. He had a calm, observant way of speaking, like he saw more than most people said out loud. "I've been watching your work this semester, Isabel," he said, handing me a card. "There's a summer internship opening at Bradley and Lane Capital in Seattle. Very competitive. I think you're ready." The name rang in my ears like a bell. Bradley and Lane was one of the most respected investment firms on the West Coast. Just getting an interview there was like catching lightning in a bottle. 3 weeks later, I walked into a sleek, glass-paneled conference room overlooking downtown Seattle. Across the oak table sat 3 sharply dressed executives, each holding a copy of my resume. One of them, a man named Zalin, leaned forward. "What do you think is the most important factor when developing an investment strategy?" I didn't hesitate. "Understanding the data is vital," I said. "But knowing The psychology behind it, that's what gives you the edge. People don't invest with spreadsheets. They invest with emotion, fear, greed, hope. There was a pause. Then the three of them exchanged a look. A small nod. I got the offer. That summer changed everything. I immersed myself in every aspect of the job: risk analysis, client behavior reports, volatility trends, internal memos, shareholder presentations. I asked questions no one else dared to ask, stayed late even when no one asked me to. I wanted to learn it all. Not to prove anything to anyone else, but because I knew what it meant to finally belong. By the end of the internship, they offered me a full-time position as a junior investment analyst. I didn't celebrate with a loud party or social media post. I called Grandma Eleanor and Grandpa Walter. "You earned every bit of this, sweetheart," Grandpa said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're making us proud every single day." Years passed quickly. I worked hard, harder than I ever had. I learned the rhythm of markets, the language of investors, and the subtext behind every shift in the numbers. I became fluent in patterns others overlooked. Then, one sleepless week, I saw something that others missed. A handful of tech stocks we were heavily invested in started showing unusual growth. On paper, they looked like breakout stars. Revenue, surging, market buzz strong. But something felt off. While most analysts praised the uptick, I dug deeper. 2 days of combing through records, tracing numbers backwards, flipping through appendices and footnotes. And then I saw it. Those companies were engaging in circular revenue, buying their own products through shell accounts to inflate growth. Artificial success, a ticking time bomb. If we didn't pull out fast, the firm stood to lose over $32 million in client funds. I didn't hesitate. I compiled a 42-page analysis, risk simulation models, and historical data comparisons. That Monday morning, I walked into the executive boardroom and laid it all out. No one interrupted, not once. When I finished, the CFO turned slowly to the CEO and said, "She just saved the company." 3 days later, the entire portfolio was restructured based on my analysis. 6 months after that, Bradley and Lane reported an 11.4% growth in profits, its highest in 7 years. The firm didn't just recover, it soared. And that moment, it changed everything for me. I was promoted to lead investment strategist, handed a corner office with a view, and given a team of analysts to mentor. But even with the title, the recognition, and the respect, I wasn't done. Late into the night, after meetings and market updates and coffee-fueled brainstorming sessions, I started building something new. I called it PRISM, a behavioral risk scoring system that didn't just track numbers, but understood the forces behind them. Where traditional models focused on charts and margins, PRISM looked at people, consumer psychology, social media trends, global political patterns, the things the industry used to call unquantifiable. I didn't believe in that word anymore. If it moved people, it moved markets, and that meant it could be measured. At first, PRISM was my secret project. Something I worked on during quiet hours, testing it against historical data, adjusting its logic. Then, one Friday afternoon, it accurately predicted a sharp dip in a major retail stock days before it happened, based solely on a surge in customer dissatisfaction across online platforms. Upper management took notice. A year later, PRISM wasn't just mine. It was integrated into the core investment strategy of the firm. Our competitors were still relying on outdated models. We weren't. Within 6 months, we had overtaken 2 of our biggest rivals in market performance. Internally, people started calling me the strategist with a sixth sense. I still remember the morning the CEO, Richard Langley, called me into the senior boardroom. The walls were lined with cityscape photos, the kind of room you don't walk into unless something big is happening. I sat at the head of the table, heart steady, but aware of every breath. Richard smiled across the polished table. "Isabel, he said. "We're creating a new role, Chief Strategic Investment Officer, and there's no one more deserving than you." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. 4 years earlier, I was the forgotten daughter, told to consider community college because real potential lived in someone else. And now, I was being asked to lead strategy for one of the most powerful investment firms in the country. But I didn't cry. I didn't scream or run to prove anything to anyone. Instead, that evening, I drove to a familiar red brick house in Salem, my grandparents' home. The kitchen smelled like cinnamon. Grandma was baking, and Grandpa was already boiling water for tea. I laid the appointment letter on the table between us. They read it together, side by side, then looked at me with the same pride they had always shown me, even when I was just a girl with a dream and no audience. "Little Isabel," Grandpa whispered, "you've come a long way." And the truth was, I had. But I hadn't done it to prove anyone wrong. I'd done it to finally prove something to myself. After accepting the role of Chief Strategic Investment Officer, I knew I wanted to mark the moment, not with grandeur or press releases, but with a small gathering. Just those who had stood by me. My grandparents, a few close friends, a couple of trusted colleagues. It felt right, intimate, honest. When I casually mentioned the idea to my mother over a rare phone call, her response was unexpectedly enthusiastic. "You should let us host it," she offered, her voice light and warm, unnaturally so. "Do it at home. It'll be more intimate. The family can reunite too." I hesitated. There had never been any acknowledgement, no apology, no conversation about the past. But maybe, this could be a turning point, a chance to rebuild, to start again. I agreed. "I'll take care of everything," she said. "Just send over the money for catering and decorations. I'll handle the rest." I wired $3,500 into her account the next morning, and I didn't ask a single question. 1 week later, I arrived at the house I hadn't stepped foot in since college. The driveway looked the same. So did the white fence. But inside, the place was transformed. There were white orchids draped across every table, golden ribbons wrapped up the banister, and the scent of gourmet catering filled the air. It was more lavish than I expected, and far more coordinated than anything I imagined my mother could do alone. I spotted Grandma Eleanor and Grandpa Walter by the bar, talking to a few extended relatives. The moment felt surreal, like stepping onto a set instead of walking into a home. Then I saw her, Chloe. She descended the stairs in a form-fitting red satin dress, her makeup flawless, arm linked with a tall man I didn't recognize. She smiled like she owned the room. And in many ways, she always had. As I raised my glass to begin my speech, my mother abruptly stepped forward, beaming. "Dear family," she began, voice ringing with excitement. "We're here today not just to reconnect, but to celebrate something truly special. Chloe and her boyfriend Andrew are officially engaged." Applause exploded around me. I stood frozen. I turned to my mother in disbelief. She didn't even glance my way. It was as if I were just another guest. I took a breath, about to step forward, when my father intercepted. His hand gripped my wrist, tightly, firm, and final. "Don't ruin this," he whispered through clenched teeth. "If you make a scene, don't expect anything more from this family. No contact, no inheritance, nothing." His words weren't new. They were a pattern, always used to keep me quiet. But I wasn't that girl anymore. I slowly pulled my arm from his grasp, lifted my glass again, and stepped to the center of the room. "Excuse me," I said, my voice calm but resolute. "May I have just a moment?" The room fell into an uneasy hush. Chloe stopped mid-smile. My mother's brow furrowed just slightly. "This gathering, I continued, was planned to celebrate a major milestone in my life. I was recently appointed Chief Strategic Investment Officer at Bradley and Lane Capital. Murmurs rippled. Some faces shifted, and I sent the money to host this event. My mother agreed to organize it. She never once mentioned it would be used to announce Chloe's engagement. Gasps and hushed whispers rippled through the room like a slow, rising wave. I stood still in the center, my voice steady even as my heart pounded beneath my dress. I'm not against Chloe's engagement, I said, scanning the room. But what I can't stay silent about is the pattern, one that's followed me my entire life. Once again, this family tried to erase me from my own moment, just like it always has. Across the room, Andrew's face darkened with confusion. He turned to Chloe. You told me this was a family gathering, he said, his voice low. I was going to tell you, Chloe stammered. I just wanted to wait for the right time. By using your sister's money, he cut in sharply, to stage your big moment. His expression hardened. I came here expecting to celebrate, to feel welcomed, not to witness someone being sidelined in her own story. He set his champagne glass down and walked out without another word. Chloe followed, heels clicking rapidly against the hardwood floor, but the front door slammed before she could catch up. Her perfect evening crumbled in an instant. The room went deathly silent. Then my father stepped forward, red-faced and shaking. You should know your place, Isabel, he spat. This is still our home. No, I said quietly, lifting my chin. This is a house built on favoritism, not family. And it hasn't been my home in a long, long time. I turned to face my grandparents who hadn't moved. Grandma Eleanor's eyes glistened, and Grandpa Walter gripped his cane tightly. I took a few steps toward them. I don't need the rest of this family to know who I am, I said, because I know. And the people who've always believed in me, they know too. I walked toward the door, ready to leave behind every ounce of bitterness I had carried. But behind me, Chloe's voice rang out, high-pitched and trembling with rage. You've always been jealous of me, she cried. You hate that people love me. You can't stand seeing me happy, so you destroy everything. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to, because I wasn't hurt anymore. I was just tired. Tired of the same broken record. Tired of a version of love that only came with conditions and comparisons. Grandma Eleanor's voice broke through the tension, sharp and clear. Chloe, she said, her tone calm but cutting. You made your choices. Don't dump the consequences on your sister. My mother, pale with a mix of shock and fury, stepped forward next. Isabel, who do you think you are? To humiliate your sister like this, in front of our family? I looked her directly in the eye. I don't need to think, Mom. I just told the truth. And I've stayed silent long enough. Behind her, my father grabbed her wrist, trying to pull her back, but his voice came cold and deliberate. If you walk out that door, Isabel, he said, you're no longer part of this family. No inheritance, no contact. As far as we're concerned, you don't exist. I opened my mouth to respond, but someone else spoke first. Before I could speak, Grandpa Walter stepped forward. He hadn't raised his voice all night, but now it rang out with a weight that stopped everyone cold. Thomas, if you're going to cut Isabel out of this family, he said, steady and unshaken, then it's time we clarify a few things. All heads turned. Grandma Eleanor moved beside him, her hand resting gently on his arm. Her voice was calm, measured, but there was steel beneath it. We updated our will 3 months ago, she said, loud enough for every person in the room to hear. The entire estate, our home, our savings, our investment portfolio, it's All going to Isabel. My mother gasped. Her eyes went wide, color draining from her face. What? She whispered. You can't be serious. We've seen enough, Grandpa said, unwavering. Enough to know who lives with values and who lives off of being coddled. My mother's voice cracked. But Chloe is my daughter. She's your granddaughter. So is Isabel, Grandma Eleanor said firmly. But she's the only one who never demanded anything, who never manipulated, never expected the world to be handed to her. She rose up through silence, through struggle, and she did it with grace. Across the room, Chloe stood on the stairs, her red dress rumpled, her mascara streaking faintly down her cheek. She burst into tears, her sobs echoing like sirens in the Too Perfect house. Then she fled, heels pounding up the stairs, the red fabric of her dress flaring behind her like a warning. My mother just stood there, trembling, her eyes flicking between me and my grandparents, searching for something to say. But no words came. My father turned away, lips pressed into a hard, colorless line. I stood silently, purse in hand, still reeling from what had just unfolded. I didn't ask for this, I finally said to my grandparents, voice low. I didn't do any of this for the money. We know, Grandpa said, placing a hand on my shoulder. And that, Grandma added softly, is exactly why you deserve it. I glanced around the room, once so familiar, now foreign. The walls, the lighting, even the faces, they all felt like part of a stage that had collapsed mid-performance. One by one, the remaining relatives looked away, unable to meet my eyes, as if only now realizing they'd been part of something deeply broken. No one stopped me as I stepped toward the door. Outside, the spring night breeze brushed gently across my face. I inhaled deeply, the scent of blooming apple blossoms drifting from the backyard. Somewhere behind me, the door clicked shut, not like a punishment, but like the final sentence in a book that had taken too long to finish. On the ride back to my grandparents' house, I sat in silence until Grandma reached over and gently took my hand. You don't have to fight anymore, Isabel, she said. You've already proven everything you needed to. And for the first time in my life, I truly believed her. 3 years have passed since the night I walked out of that house for the last time. The night I left behind the version of myself who had always waited to be noticed, to be chosen, to finally be enough for people who never really wanted to see me. I never looked back. And I've never needed to. In those 3 years, I poured everything I had into my work at Bradley and Lane. I arrived at the office before sunrise, stayed long after the lights dimmed, refined strategy, recoded segments of the Prism algorithm, and led my team through market swings that once would have shaken even the firm's veterans. I listened to the numbers, but more importantly, I listened to the people. The clients, the employees, the voices behind the data points, and that's what set our firm apart. When Richard Langley announced his retirement, no one expected what would come next. Not the press, not the board, not even me. He walked onto the stage at our annual leadership summit, looked across the room full of shareholders and partners and said, I'm proud to name Isabel Grant as the next CEO of Bradley and Lane Capital. Applause erupted, but I didn't hear it. My heart was thundering too loudly in my ears. At 30 years old, I had just become the youngest female CEO in the firm's 60-year history. After the announcement, while camera flashes lit up the stage and hands reached out for congratulations, I stepped to the side and quietly pulled out my phone. I dialed the only number that truly mattered. Grandma. Grandpa? I said, barely holding back tears. I did it. I could hear Grandma Eleanor smiling through the line. You've always been worthy, Isabel. From the very beginning. Meanwhile, 40 miles away in Salem, not much had changed. Chloe, now 27, no longer wore the engagement ring. Her life had unraveled slowly, quietly. She had dropped out of a fashion program, tried her hand at becoming an influencer, then a life coach, then a jewelry designer. None of it lasted more than a few months. Eventually, she moved back in with our parents, into the same room she once took from me. I haven't spoken to them since that night. Sometimes Grandma mentions they've asked about me through mutual friends. But I don't ask for more. Some relationships are meant to be left behind, especially when they're built on denial, competition, and the fear of someone else's light shining. Every Sunday, I still visit my grandparents. We toast sourdough bread, flip through old photo albums, and sit beneath the same magnolia tree that once shaded their wedding anniversary photos. Grandma tells childhood stories I barely remember, and Grandpa pretends to forget them just so I'll tell them all over again. One afternoon, I asked them if they ever regretted leaving everything to me. "We didn't leave it because of what it was worth," Grandma said. "We left it to the one who understood value, not just of money, but of choice. The one who chose integrity over convenience, silence when it mattered, and voice when it counted. That was the greatest inheritance they ever gave me. Not land, not stocks, but faith."